Hi everyone, welcome to THT, and today we're gonna talk about the FENNEC red deck. So, I'm probably taking you by surprise here by showing you FENNEC, which is a leader that didn't get any attention in set 2, despite its obvious qualities. And in this video, I'll try to explain you what I believe to be the best build for her, as well as the reason why I think she was not necessarily very playable in set 2, but now in set 3 she's a lot stronger. And now, of course, go into details over the different card choices that you can make in order to make her the best possible leader that she can possibly be. So, moving on with this FENNEC red deck, it is effectively an aggro deck, a little bit more centered towards the tempo element, so she's kind of a aggro tempo deck that is trying to take advantage by abusing FENNEC ability as often as possible, trying to put threats on the board and simultaneously eliminate the early game threats of the opponent to get a board state advantage. And once she gets that board state advantage, she will try to finish the game using, of course, one of the many units that comes into play ready, or using Surprise Strike, Daring Raids to deal the last bit of damage. So it's a very well built deck that it's not a deck that I've invented. It is a creation of my good friend Dylan, which you probably know if you are hanging around the Take Initiative, because he's someone who's very active on Take the Initiative and does very well on the league. He's part of my testing group, and he's also, in my opinion, just an excellent player. And he has been working on this deck since set 2, obviously, since it's the moment where she came out. But hasn't had much success in set 2 with her because simply the deck had a horrible matchup against Boba in general. Now that Boba is banned, things are a lot different. And FENNEC is able to operate a lot better. And because she's from set 2, nobody has really given her another chance, excepted my good friend Dylan, and he's having a great success with it in the league. So if you don't believe me, just hanging over the league data here. As you can see here, FENNEC here has the highest win percentage of the entire league here. Actually second with Django Fett. 71%. She's Django Fed 74. But yeah, 70%. And the sample size is not super high, but it's not so small. So you get yourself a 71% win rate here is pretty good. So it's an environment where Empress Palpatine does see a lot of play, which does advantage, of course, aggro decks, but it still is a very impressive win rate. For this deck, which is the proof by itself that the deck has legs. Doesn't of course mean that it's going to be the next big thing, but it definitely means that the deck is definitely playable and can definitely win, and in my opinion definitely stronger than people were expecting. Obviously I also played against the deck, that obviously what triggered my decision to make a video about it, because I thought that the deck was very strong playing against it. And also I happened to play with the deck as well, and I also found the deck to be quite a bit stronger than what I was expecting. Not easy to play, but if you can play it right, it is really strong. So, without further ado, let's talk a little bit about the leaders. So FENNEC she has one of the strongest leaders ability in the game. The ability to ambush is, as you know, one of the most powerful keyword in the game. Allow your unit to have an immediate impact on the game as they come into play and can deal with something. And often ambush unit, if you play the ambush on the right target, will be able to ambush something, survive the attack, and stay on the battlefield. And always the process of eliminating a threat of your opponent while keeping a threat of your own on the board is always incredibly powerful. This ability has just two restrictions. The one is that you get to pay a resource to use that, and that it only works for units that cost 4 or less. But to be fair, paying 1 to give ambush to something, as we know with timely interventions, is well worth the price. The problem often with timely intervention is the card disadvantage that it provokes. You have to pay 1 and then ambush with the unit alongside it to be able to play it. And if you want to play it without having card disadvantage, you have to pay for 2. You have to smuggle it. And then obviously 2 is definitely a much bigger cost to be able to ambush something. But 1 is definitely a very reasonable cost to get some ambush. And often paying 1 for an ambush unit will basically be on curve with, by comparison to units that have naturally have ambush on their as a keyword printed on their card. So this flexibility to be able to play any of your units either as a regular unit or with a unit with ambush, depending on the curve, it makes your curve incredibly smooth, and it also gives you a lot of flexibility that I think is very powerful. Once she's deployed, she's a 4/4 saboteur, and her ability becomes effectively free, which is very powerful. So I think one of the early to deploy is, in my opinion, our greatest weakness. 4/4 stat lines is not great in the game, as it's very vulnerable to most of the removals in the game, makes her incredibly vulnerable. So she doesn't stay in play very often. But if you play it right, you should be able to get at least 1 attack off her, and then of course she has 4 attack, and because she has Saboteur, she's not going to get blocked by any sentinels, and sometimes of course she can be used to get rid of a shielded unit. If she can stay into play longer than 1 turn, that's already great for you, but as I said earlier, this leader, you're mostly playing it for leader ability, not for leader deploy. Even though all leader deploys can be very effective, especially when you want to smuggle something without having to pay the cost and you think that your leader has a chance to survive an attack. So going back into the deck, one of the things that makes also FENNEC Shand a lot better, that was making FENNEC Shand so bad against Boba, is that obviously she was a 4/4, so that Boba that deploys at the same time as her could simply just attack her and kill her while staying alive. But once again, Boba is now bound, so we don't have to worry about this anymore. So a couple of words on the deck itself. As you can see, it is a classic aggro shell. You could pretty much replace Fennec by Sabine here in this very specific instance, and the deck would not be so different. You have a classic yellow, white, red aggro shell with, of course, powerful early game threats, and then and of course ways to finish the game. This deck had a little bit of disruption. We could play 3 copies of Spark of Rebellion, 3 copies of Kira to improve the matchup against Control, which is a bad matchup for the deck, and to be a little bit more interactive against decks that don't really run a lot of units. And then of course we're going to get into the details of the different card choice, starting of course by the cheapest card. But before we get into this, I just want to talk about the base. Of course, we're using Tarkin Town. Tarkin Town is exactly what we need for this deck, because it is, as we said, a tempo deck, where sometimes we get to ambush something, we don't get to kill it. We can finish it off with Tarkin Town to get rid of larger threats, because this game is very much about trying to keep the board clean using the ambush abilities of FENNEC Shand. So keeping the board clean and adding threats to the board, overwhelming the opponent early stage of the game, and then finishing off. The cheapest card of the deck is going to be Greedo. Greedo is excellent in this deck. I would say in general in the meta, Greedo is not a great card because there's a lot of pings, a lot of ways to just deal 1 bit of damage to a specific unit, notably with Django Fett. But I would say that Greedo is very strong in this deck because he can be used as a Cloud Rider. So if you use FENNEC Shand ability, she turns into effectively a Cloud Rider of 3/1 ambush for 2, which is very good. So the flexibility of either playing this as a 1-drop 3/1 or as a 2-drop 3/1 ambush is just extremely good in this deck, because you effectively have a better version of a card that I think is already very good. And of course you still get the Death Trigger, which sometimes can deal extra damage and be combined with Tarkin Town for great effects. So yeah, Greedo is just extremely good in this deck. It once again kind of fulfill the curve just right and can be played either as a 2-drop or as a 1-drop. This flexibility is just extremely powerful. Any card that is very strong when ambush but doesn't have ambush is naturally going to be great in this deck because we have the power to give them ambush. Then we got Kata Turncoat, which is another 1-drop. Let us go for a double 1-drop opening if we have the 2 Kata Turncoat, if we have Kata Turncoat plus Greedo. And it's a threat that is, it's a card that has made its way in almost every single yellow-white aggro deck, and the reason for it is because we're talking about a 2/3 in space. A 2/3 in space is just not that easy to kill. It's just it's just very annoying to kill. It's a very sticky threat that is annoying to interact with. And yes, when it dies, it draws you a card, but the amount of effort that your opponent has to do to get rid of those Cat and Turncoat is relatively high most of the time. Making Cat and Turncoat has been a mainstay in almost every single yellow-white decks so far. So just a generally not particularly powerful with FENNEC. It's not really the kind of card that we would want to smuggle most of the time, even though we can smuggle it to one-shot something like a TIE Phantoms, which is great. But most of the time, we're just going to be playing this card as a 2/3 for one, as just a threat that is going to be annoying to deal with. Next, we got Sabine. I'm relatively confident in saying that this is probably one of the best Sabine deck, not in the sense that Sabine the leader, but Sabine the unit, that one of the deck that utilizes Sabine the best, because obviously their ability to once again ambush does make Sabine very strong. So any units that basically gains a bonus for attacking, or is stronger when it's attacking than when it's defending, is naturally going to be very strong in combination with FENNEC, because you get to pay an extra resources, you get to play this, and you get guarantee usage of your on-attack ability. Sabine with ECL is being used often to clear out 1 health unit, so you get to kill that 1 health unit and keep your 2/3 clean on the board. But having to use energy combo jab on such a small unit is often not what you want to do. But FENNEC can do this without, of course, sacrificing the ambush ability for later on in the game. She can use that ability for other units later on in the game. So once again, the flexibility of either playing this card as just a regular 2-drop, which is, as I said, as we know, one of the best 2-drop in the game, or ambushing it on turn 2, makes this card incredibly flexible and very powerful, more powerful than it is in a traditional deck. Then we got Queen Squadron, which is good for the exact same reason as A-Wing. It's obviously a good aggressive 2-drop that can put a lot of pressure on the opponent, and once again, it's a card that really gets a lot stronger when it gets ambushed, because obviously we get the guarantee usage of raid. So there's some sort of 3 health units, space unit on the other side, notably like a Sabine deck. We can just ambush the A-Wing, kill the opponent space units, and keep the A-Wing on the field, which is great. Just a really, really great card in general, but specifically good in this deck because of the ability of FENNEC to turn it into an ambush unit. Then we got Cassian. So Cassian, not necessarily amazing with FENNEC ambush, but as you know, it's one of the most auto-include red-white card in almost any aggro deck. Even though you could argue that Poe and Records are more impactful in decks that have ECL, Cassian has the advantage of being just good across the board in all red-white decks. It gives you a solid turn 2 play, as well, of course, as a card you can smuggle later on in the game as a ready unit. So I have to say that, generally speaking, this deck has no difficulties finding ways to spend 3 resources on turn 2, because obviously it has other 3-drops, and it can also place 2-drop as 3-drops using FENNEC ability. So it's a deck that really doesn't have curve issue at all. It's very, very smooth with this curve because of FENNEC ability. So often you're going to be preferring to use Cassian as a smuggle card, as it's going to give you extra reach in the later stage of the game when you want to finish off the job. Moving on, we got 2 copies of Fleet Lieutenant. So Fleet Lieutenant, as you know, is one of the primary reasons to be playing Rebel card. It's one of the best Rebel payoff in the game. The card has been here since the very beginning of the starter set, and still today, one of the best cards in the game. Just a great 3/3 and one of the most powerful when played ability. So yeah, the fact that you can ambush Fleet Units is very great. You get to kill something, then at the same time attack with another thing, gives them +2 attack. It's great. The only problem with Fleet Unit in this particular build is that our leader is not Rebel, and we do play quite a few units that are not rebels. So this makes it that sometimes future turns can be a little bit situational. So we only play 2 copies of it because it turns out we don't play as that many rebels in the build. So we have to be a little bit careful, and sometimes it can be a little bit more difficult to play, but it's still, of course, an amazing card in an aggro build. Then we got another rebel, and so one that has been a little bit forgotten. It is the Rogue Operative. Rogue Operative is so much better in this deck than it is in a regular build because, once again, she's a very strong card when she attacks, but when she's not attacking, then she's just a 2/4 for 3, which is not great. But as we know, we can obviously ambush with her using FENNEC Shen's ability, and suddenly she's guaranteed to be able to get a +2 attack and no saboteur. Ideal to get rid of shielded units. You want to get rid of something like a village protector. She will get rid of that, and then she will leave on the field a very threatening unit that attacks for 4 and doesn't bother about sentinel units. So it's just a very solid card in this build, as you can imagine. Just ambush for 4, just really good. So basically, kind of like, imagine this card as kind of a 4 LOM. When she's, imagine like a 4 LOM that has saboteur, kind of, and that can also be played as a flexible 3-drop when it needs to be. Like, it's just an amazing card in this deck. And 4 LOM, as you know, is one of the best ambush units in the game. Well, this is basically just a better version of 4 LOM, which is pretty great. So Minion Falcon is not the card that benefits the most from ambush, because obviously it comes into play already ready, but sometimes giving Falcon's ambush can be good. But obviously the main purpose of the Falcon in this deck is to be an aggressive unit that can come into play and finish the game by attacking in space. It comes into play ready and can attack right away. I do not advise in this deck to play Falcon early on in the game unless you have the intention of suiciding it, because having to pay the upkeep cost is a massive cost, as we know. Is a massive cost for a deck like this, especially since with FENNEC Shen ability we really need every single resource we can put our hands on. So most likely Falcon is a card you're going to be playing in the later stage of the game in order to as a finisher. It's kind of how you're supposed to be using it. If you wonder to know, if you are using giving ambush to Falcon, it doesn't work the same way as with the fire spray, where you get to ambush and then get to put the when play trigger that allows them to get ready into play. And the reason why that doesn't work like this is because the Falcon is not a when played ready effect. So that means that it's not a trigger. Therefore, if you ambush with the Falcon, it will come into play. You won't be able to get benefit from the ready ability at all. So that's just a little rule point here on the Falcon. Next, we got Red 3. Obviously, the main purpose of the deck is to establish bold presence by playing ambush units, getting rid of the opponent units, and this way kind of build up a very large board. And obviously, what's the best thing you can do whenever you build a very large board is to get a Red 3 to make all those units Red 1. I think at accepted Greedo, I think every single unit in our deck is heroism, so very strong to give them Red 1. And Red 3 is also a card that benefits from being ambushed as well, because of its Red 1 ability. Can get rid of the opponent's 2/3s and stay alive. Very useful, notably against the Bean. Just a great card in general, and I think it's particularly good in this deck. Then we got K2SO. K2SO is, as you know, one of the primary energy conversion targets in Sabine, because the card is amazing with ambush, the ability to come into play, target the small units, kill that units, and deal a bunch of overwhelm damage, and leave into play like a 4/1 that has something to do when it dies. It's just very amazing value. So once again, we have the option either play K2S on curve for 4 or play it for 5, and then it turns into some sort of, imagine this as a Syndicate Lackeys, but like much stronger. And as I said, Syndicate Lackey is already one of the best ambush card in the game. You get K2S, so it's kind of like a Syndicate Lackeys that is better because it has overwhelm, it's a rebel, and it has this very powerful when defeated effect. Another cool thing as well with this is that whenever you are later stage of the game, Sometimes you want to play K2SO and you want him to die right away, but obviously your opponent is not going to let you do that. It's just going to ignore it and kill you. Well, what you can do when you're playing FENNEC is that you can actually give a K2SO ambush, and then you can ambush it to suicide and then deal the 3 less damage to finish the opponent off, and that's just very, very strong. It's a source of direct damage. It's K2SO is much stronger in this deck than it is in the traditional Sabine build, which I think is quite scary by itself. Next, we got a bit of more of a kind of a out-of-the-box card. It is called Principled Outlaw, and this card has 2 main purposes. The first purpose is obviously being used with ambush, and you get to ambush with it, and then you can exhaust the ground unit, so that can be good whenever you're behind on board, get to ambush something, kill that thing, and then exhaust at the same time. So the on-attack effect can be quite powerful whenever it's combined with ambush. The second purpose is simply to be another smuggle unit. The deck is willing to go up to 6 resources. Usually doesn't want to go beyond 6, but is definitely willing to go up to 6. And then that gives you another card you can smuggle out to give yourself a bit more of presence whenever you run out of gas. So it's only a 2-of because obviously the on-attack ability remains relatively situational, but in the right situation it is very strong. Then we got 3 copies of Kira. Kira is kind of the answer that the deck has found against more kind of late game. Something to notice is that FENNEC is definitely more of a tempo build over like a Sabine, which is really purely aggro. This means that the deck is slightly slower than most of the Sabine deck that you know of, and because the deck is slightly slower, it has to respect the opponent's hands and the opponent's answers a bit more. Notably stuff like Overwhelming Barrage and that kind of thing. So whenever you get a little bit of experience in the deck and you get to know the matchups, you know what kind of cards you want to stop at certain specific moments. And this is where Kira can be extremely useful, adding additional threats on the board as well as cancelling out the possible answer your opponent could have, so you basically can kind of dominate the game. And Kira is very good for that. It also helps as one of the most difficult matchups for the deck, which is generally the boss control deck. Kira will help with this as well. So I would say Kira is, as I said, it's because the deck is slower than traditional aggro deck. It has to respect the opponent's hands more than a traditional aggro deck. So this is why Kira deck is here. Kira is here. Moving on, we got finally a new card. It is Plo Koon, which is basically the perfect card for the deck because it does everything the deck wants, which is clear the board, clear the battlefield, and then put a threat on the board. And Plo Koon is, as we said earlier, this deck is all about board presence. It's all about putting threats on the board and dealing with the opponent threat at the same time, which means that turning on Coordinate is quite easy for this deck, especially as Plo Koon will typically come out at the same time as FENNEC, which gives you, of course, an extra unit. So Plo Koon is really a lot better in decks where your leader deploys on 5, because it makes the coordinates so much easier to turn on, because you get an extra unit to do that. So all you need to do is to have at least 1 unit on the board, and you deploy your leader, and then Plo Koon at 3 units. So obviously, it's the only unit that has ambush natively, so doesn't need FENNEC's ability, which is fine because it costs 5 already. So yeah, it's just a very, very good card, because of course 6/6 for 5 ambush is just incredible, and once again it comes to play, kill something relatively large for that matter, and then even after this, usually because it has 6 health, it will stay on the battlefield, and then if your unit doesn't deal with it, then it's a 6 attack unit that is coming as well. So it's just a very solid card. Let's now talk about the removal and the card that you don't really play on curve. Starting off with Daring Raid. So as you see, we're not running 4 cards, I believe in, so we can definitely afford to play a few cards that are non-heroism, and Daring Raid is one of those cards. So Daring Raid is obviously a great combination with Stark Town. You can play Daring Raid, Attacking Town to kill something that's up to 5 health, which is very strong. It's obviously a card that can kill small units. Sometimes, basically, the deck has no problem killing 2/3s because it can just ambush them. 3/2s are a bit more of a problem, so units that have high attack and low defense are usually a higher problem for the deck. And the reason is because then you're going to be ambushing them, and most likely the unit that's going to ambush it is going to die as a result of that ambush. So obviously you want to counter this by killing those high attack, low health unit with daring raid, and you want to kill the low attack, high health units with your ambush. That's basically how things work out. So daring raid just complements what the deck is trying to do extremely well. And obviously, it's also a finisher that can be dealt into base. So just a very, very strong card in the deck. Then we got Spark of Rebellion. So I've already talked about this, but basically the deck is not a pure aggro deck. So it needs to be able to respect what the opponent is able to do a bit more than your traditional Sabine deck. And Spark of Rebellion is one of the ways to prevent the opponent from able to do what it does. And to have like those specific answers. So you don't necessarily want to play this card on turn 1, unless you really have nothing else to do. You want to play this card later on in the game to basically remove the key card that will allow the opponents to stabilize. And Spark of Rebellion is just very good at doing that. And it also helps once again in the Bosk matchup, which is a particularly bad matchup for the deck. Obviously, we got Surprise Strike. Surprise Strike, I've talked about this card being the best mono-yellow card in the game, and I still believe it is the best mono-yellow card in the game. Plus 3 attack here, and attack is just an excellent finisher that deserves 3 spots in the deck, obviously, to finish the game off. In combination was one of the many units that we have that comes to play ready, whether it is Cassian or Minion Falcon. 2 copies of Waylays. There are certain things that cannot be dealt with by ambushing. Once again, the deck is a tempo deck more than it is a pure aggro deck, so we need to have some sort of ways to get rid of very large units, and Waylay is the way for us to do that. So we can play 2 copies of Waylay. Then we got 2 copies of Hotshot DR44 Blaster. You'll be hard pressed to find an aggro deck that plays yellow and doesn't want to run DR44 Blaster. It's an amazing card. It's the fact that it smuggles gives you this extra punch of attack without requiring you to use a card for it. Is just extremely good. This deck of course plays both red and yellow, so sometimes it will have the option to just play the blaster for 1 and attack with it after. So just very solid card, especially in this deck. Okay. Yes, I think we're still in the main deck, aren't we? No, this is we're now we'll start. Okay, so we're done basically with the main deck. So we're now talk about the sideboard a little bit more. So sideboard is a bit more like experimental. Dylan has not completely figured out every single slot in the sideboard, but this is kind of like the couple of ideas that it has so far in order to kind of improve the deck and makes it a little bit better and make it a little bit better. So we're gonna start off with Heroic Sacrifice. So some people might be surprised to see Heroic Sacrifice being played in a deck that has access to yellow. So we already have Ultra DR44 Blasters for damage. We already have Surprise Strike. So what do we need Heroic Sacrifice as a one-of on top of this? Well, it simply is an additional buff. This one has the ones of costing 1. The ability to be recycled for draw can be relevant, and the when defeated ability can be very relevant, notably with K2S. So it's kind of like an extra diverse. Usually, whenever you are running like aggro decks, like an aggro mirror, buffs are very important. And we're already playing 3 copies of the Surprise Strike, so then every buff we play after that can be like a diversity of different buffs, and we can choose which one we want depending on the situation. So something notable is like whenever you don't really know which buff is going to be better, it's going to depend a lot on the situation. It's usually a good idea to play the diversity of different buffs. So then if you draw, let's say, Heroic Sacrifice and let's say a Breaking In, you get to choose which one to play, to keep, which one to resource depending on the matchup. It gives you kind of like the flexibility of choosing the right one for you depending on the matchup. So Heroic Sacrifice it's a one-off. It's not really a big deal, but it helps against aggro. So the other buff we're running is Breaking In because it has the advantage of giving Saboteur, which can be very useful. And we play it as a one-off once again. It's just more buffs. And instead of running like 2 Breaking In, we are running a diversity of buffs, Breaking In and Heroic Sacrifice. So we get yourself kind of the flexibility depending on the situation, because there's it's not clear which one is better in a situation. Then we got Pirated Starfighter, and Pirated Starfighter is actually a pretty great tech, notably against Django and against space decks in general. It basically, the way you use this card is you are ambushing it using FENNEC BUILD for 3 resources, which is fairly cheap, and then you get to come into play, you get rid of anything that has 3 health or less, and because Pirated Starfighter has 4 health, is unlikely to actually die from that operation, so you're simply just gonna bounce the Pirated Starfighter back into your hand, and you're gonna be able to do this over and over and over again. So imagine this sort of like as a removal that just keeps coming back into your hand. Obviously, you got the flexibility. Sometimes you're gonna be wanting to play it as a unit, bouncing something like something cheap like a pirated, like a Cardinal Spacer or Greedo. But basically, most of the main purpose of this card is to be used as a recursive removal in space that can kill units one after the other and every time bounce back into your hand. And that tech is actually pretty strong against Django, so this is why we're playing 2 copies of Pirated Starfighter. Then we got 2 copies of Wolf, which is our main answers against deck that is able to heal a lot. So Wolf does that very well. Sometimes it can also be ambushed with the Saboteurs. 3 attack Saboteur can be quite good at killing certain things, but most likely it's an anti-heal mechanism, and we are running 2 of them. Then we got the Disabling Fang Fighters, so we got 2 copies of Fang Fighters to remove upgrades. Very strong against Bosk in general, or against so that really helps out. So we play 2 copies of Fang Fighters, we have the Fang Fighters, and we got the Wolves. That's really to help in the Bosk matchup. 2 Change of Hearts to against pretty much all the soft control decks. It's not bad against Bosk either, but it's most likely against soft control like the Palpatine decks and all that stuff. Change of Hearts, 2 copies as a finisher. So this is basically the sideboard here, as you can see. 2 Change of Hearts, 2 Fang Fighters, 2 Pirated Starfighters, 2 Wolves, and then 2 buffs for the aggro mirror, kind of a diversity of them. So let's talk a little bit about the matchups for this deck. So obviously it is not my deck, so I don't have a very specific sideboard plan to give you, and I don't think Dylan has figured out yet what was the exact sideboard plan, so I'm sorry about that. However, we can talk about the matchup a little bit. Basically, from what Dylan told me, the deck does really well against Sabine, against basically any aggro deck that plays a lot of ground units, because it will typically be able to be slightly more defensive than they are, and usually whenever there's 2 decks that are fighting each other, you want to be either a lot faster than your opponent or slightly slower, and FENNEC BUILD is just slightly slower than Sabine, and is able to really kill off the threats. Using ambush is just extremely useful to be able to get rid of Sabine threats and be able to stick threats of your own, and that just is very, very powerful. Yes, Sabine is also going to get ambush, but his ambush is going to be easier. It's only going to be once per game, while FENNEC BUILD is going to have multiple ambushes throughout. So that's very powerful. Another cool things about this deck is that you are so it's a deck that usually gonna do well against those. It's gonna do well against like mid-range decks in general, as the ambush, the way to dominate the game is very good. It's also gonna do quite well against forgot the name. So against, of course, the super like Palpatine's deck that are fairly slow. Maybe not as well as a regular aggro deck, but it's gonna do pretty well in those as well. And so typically the deck will struggle against, I would say, against hard control like Bosk, because really one of the way to beat Bosk is really to be like very, very fast, and FENNEC BUILD is just slightly slower than regular aggro deck, which is detrimental. But in order to make up for that, we have selective discard, which can be very strong, so there's that. I'm sorry I can't get into much more details about it, because but it's basically kind of like how the deck plays out. And So now let's talk about a few cards that you might be curious to know why they were not included into the deck. So first of all, we're going to talk about R2-D2. Definitely one of the all-star of the set, a card that is just extremely flexible. First of all, the deck is very consistent with its curve, notably thanks to FENNEC BUIld ability that allows you to turn any of your 2-drop into a 3-drop, or any of your 3-drop into a 4-drop. So it doesn't really usually need more consistency, so the when play ability of R2 is not super beneficial in this deck. R2 is not a rebel, so it cannot be boosted by Fleet Lieutenant, and is not a particularly good card to ambush with as being a 2-4, not necessarily the best card to ambush with. So R2 just simply didn't make the cut compared to the other 2-drop the deck has access to. Then we got Coruscant Dissident, which is a card that's been quite popular in FENNEC deck, generally speaking, as she has this on-attack ability that allows you to ready a resource that can be then useful to play like a 1-drop, which the deck has plenty of. This card simply did not make the cut because it turns out that the on-attack ability is relatively situational and the 3-4 stat line is simply just not that amazing. Then a lot of you might be very surprised by the non-inclusion of Sabine. So the reason why I think Sabine has not been included into this deck is because the on-attack ability is just too unreliable. So the problem with this is that there's basically kind of two options you have with Sabine, right? So in this deck you got about 2/3 of yellow unit and 1/3 of red units. That means that basically Sabine's range ability has about 66% chance of triggering, basically. And the problem with that is that it's high, but it's not guaranteed. It's far from guaranteed. And the problem is, like, if you are going to try to ambush Sabine into, let's say, a 6-drop, thinking that you're going to kill it, you are playing a very dangerous game, because if that doesn't work, then it's a massive blowout against you because you've basically ambushed a 4-drop and you didn't even kill your target. So that's a massive blowout. So you have two options. It's either you decide to play Sabine thinking that the ability is going to trigger, and then and if it doesn't trigger, it's a huge blowout. Or you play Sabine like she didn't have an ability, like assuming the ability is going to fail, and then you're not really taking advantage of the ability at all, which means that you might as well just not play the card. There's going to be some rare situations where, yes, it's like, oh yeah, if I get the trigger, it's a bonus, but if it's not, then it's no big deal. But most likely or not, you're going to have to kind of make a choice, whether you think the ability is going to trigger or when you think the ability is not going to trigger. So either way, I just found Sabine to be too unreliable. I mean, Dylan finds the Sabine to be too unreliable, and there's just simply better things to do on this curve point for the deck. So decide to not include the Sabine, the new Sabine from Twilight of the Republic. So yeah, that's it for the deck. So what are globally my impression about the deck? So once again, it's still very early on and we're still kind of developing the archetype. So it's not entirely clear how well positioned in the meta the archetype is, but it is definitely powerful. I would say definitely underestimated. And I think that if you're looking for an aggro deck that is a bit different to play than your traditional aggro deck, FENNEC could be a great choice for you. It's very fun to play, and it's also quite budget. Like, as you can see, we're not playing... The only legendary that we're playing is the 3 copies of Million Falcon and 2 copies of Change of Heart and Sideboard. Change of Heart is not really an expensive legendary card. Million Falcon is, but basically, once again, once you get your Falcon, the deck is extremely cheap. So I know there's some people going to asking me, what would you play instead of Falcon if you couldn't play a Falcon? And the answer is maybe I would play For a Cause I Believe In. Because, I mean, For a Cause I Believe In is not guaranteed to... that we're playing 11 non-heroism card, but maybe you change the build to be a little bit more heroism focused. I mean, actually, we're playing 13, yeah, 13 non-heroism. That's actually quite a lot, but it deals 3 damage. It does serve kind of the same purpose of dealing for... being a sort of a finisher, so maybe I would play For a Cause I Believe In instead. I haven't thought too much about it, but basically that could be a way to go. But yeah, the deck is pretty budget. For the most part, it's very fun to play, and I think it's quite powerful and quite underestimated. And once again, sometimes it is worth it to give up a little bit of raw power just to be a little bit more kind of unexpected and and kind of unexpected. So before we are finished here, I'm gonna go for a couple of mulligan and see how it goes. So here's like we have an opening hand. So we could go Spark of Rebellion, turn 1 and then turn 2 Falcon, but this is a horrible opening because Spark of Rebellion is usually not the card you want to play first because you are an aggressive deck after all, so you need to have a threat on the board before you get to do anything else. Spark of Rebellion is more like a support card you're supposed to be playing later on in the game in order to remove the important answer the opponent might have. So unless absolutely necessary, I would usually not try to play Spark of Rebellion turn 1. The rest of the hand is pretty terrible. Fidgeton when you have no units in play is terrible. Falcon early on is terrible because then you gotta have to pay the Falcon tax that would prevent you from playing bigger cards. So this is a horrible hand I would mulligan. Okay, this is a pretty good hand. We're gonna be able to start the game off by resourcing the Blaster or resourcing a Falcon or Surprise Strike. I'll actually resource the... I would not resource the Cassian right away because right now I would much rather play a Cassian turn 2 than a Falcon turn 2. As I said, you do not want to play Falcon early in this deck as it will prevent you from playing your most expensive cards, and you need every resources you can for Shen's ability. So turn 1's being turn 2 Cassian, I would resource the Falcon and the Blaster, and then hope that I'm gonna draw something like a 3-drop that I can ambush with. And then Plo Koon is a very strong card, so I want to keep this card as often as possible, especially if there are cards that are a bit more situational that I'm willing to smuggle in between. That's a pretty good hand. Next, okay, once again, no turn 1 play here. It's actually quite unlucky because the deck plays... Okay, we play 9... 12... Yeah, the deck plays 15 turn 1 plays, so it's a little bit unlucky here to not get one. Yeah, I would try to mulligan this hand because once again, Spark of Rebellion turn 1 is not ideal. It's not as bad as the hand we have. We can go Spark of Rebellion turn 1 and turn 2 Rogue Operative, Smuggle, Deal 40 for Boston Cassian, and it's not too bad, but it's really not ideal to start out with Spark. Okay, this hand is much better. We get turn 1 A-Wing, turn 2 Red 3, turn 4 Kira, some answers, and a Plo Koon. And then finally this hand is great. Okay, this is much better. You actually like to have redundant 3-drops and 2-drops because, as I said, depending on the situation, this gives you a lot of options because you can go either A-Wing turn 1 or Sabine turn 1 depending on the arena dodge situation thing. And then you can go turn 2 Red 3 or turn 2 Cassian depending, and then you can start ambushing. You can, instead of even playing Red 3 or Cassian, you can even ambush Sabine. So this gives you like a lot of flexibility. So I would say that ideal hands are hands that have multiple 3-drops, multiple 2-drops, because this will give you a lot of options of whether you want to play a 3-drops or an ambush 2-drops, and there's always going to be like a better combination of those things depending on the situation. That's going to put you very far ahead in the early stage of the game because you're going to be able to stick threats on the board as well as killing the enemy threat, which is really the core of what this deck is trying to do. Okay, last hand here with a Greedo, so that's pretty nice. Get Greedo plus Daring Raid on turn 1. We can go basically Greedo, Daring Raid, then use Tarkin Town, so again we have a threat, remove the threat. Resource probably Falcon and Spark, or Falcon and Super Strike depending on the matchup, then turn 2 Cassian or whatever 3-drops we draw instead, and then we can smuggle Cassian or whatever. That's a pretty good hand. Anyway, that's basically it for my kind of a couple of mulligan rundown, and that's it for my deck of FENNEC Shand, a very underestimated leader, and I hope you guys are gonna give it a try and let me know if you get some good result with it. If you like this video, please like and subscribe, and let me know if there's a video or type of video that you would like to see next. Always eager to hear your suggestions. And thank you so much, and I'll see you next time.